Welcome to The Red-Haired Archaeologist. I am your host, author, and sunscreen advocate, Amanda Hope Haley. Thank you for spending some time with me today, studying artifacts our Near Eastern ancestors left behind, and considering if those items just might change how we read or read into Scripture. Last week, I feel like we ended with some sad news that the New Kingdom and what really may have been considered the best years of ancient Egypt were behind it. During the New Kingdom, as I hope you remember, there were famous pharaohs like Ramses the Great and Tutankhamun, and they were gathering wealth. They were on the offensive. They went down into Libya. They went up into the Levant, and they were conquering lands and subjugating other people, maybe going in and actually physically ruling them, maybe just turning them into vassal states where in order for people to keep their independence, they paid really heavy taxes to Egypt. But as the people around Egypt became stronger, Egypt started losing its own power. For today and next week, we're going to talk about what happened to Egypt right after the New Kingdom. This period of time ran from about 1089 to 525 BCE and is often referred to as the Third Intermediate Period. You remember we had a second intermediate period before. If you want to go back and listen to the episode about the Hyksos, that was the second intermediate period, or part of it. Today we're going to talk about that third intermediate period. It's called an intermediate period because it's a time when governance was fundamentally different from what is around it. The New Kingdom was a period of strength for Egypt with real consistency in the people who were leading it. The Third Intermediate Period had a lot of back and forth, periods where multiple pharaohs were ruling at the same time from different cities. It was just a tumultuous time. And then after the Third Intermediate Period is when the Persians come in and conquer it. And so once again, it's just markedly different. So this Third Intermediate Period, even though it wasn't so great for Egypt, it really matters to us because it's during this time period that the nation of Israel becomes a nation. All of the tribes come together. It's when we first have a king of Israel. It's when we have Saul, David, and Solomon, and then moving forward into the divided kingdom. Egypt doesn't mention Israel in its records from this time period. If you remember from last week, there's really only one place in all of the Egyptian historical records that we have found where Israel is mentioned. And in that place, the way the word Israel is used, it's meant as a people and not as a state. Although Egypt doesn't mention Israel, Israel does mention Egypt and some of its pharaohs several times. As you know, Egypt's historical records are often literally carved in stone. The records decorate temples and palaces and almost every single building that seemed to go up. It's almost like wallpaper. Back in antiquity, a lot of these carvings would have even been painted and been very, very colorful. And so the Egyptian historical record wasn't just a dusty book laying on a bookshelf somewhere. It wasn't just a collection of scrolls. It was actually out on display for everyone to see all the time. So the greatness of Egypt and the greatness of Egypt's past was really known to all the people who lived there. There aren't a lot of narrative details in a lot of these historical records. Often what you see is simply a description of Pharaoh so-and-so by the grace of his God conquered all these people. And it'll just be a list of all these people. You don't hear a lot of the stories of battle necessarily. But of course, Israel's historical records are completely different. There's nothing monumental about them, if you will, at least not any that we have found. What Israel did was they recorded their history in scrolls. The time period that we're going to be talking about today is covered in the books of Samuel and Kings in the Bible. If you open up just about any translation of the Bible, you're going to see 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Those are artificial divisions. The Septuagint, this is that Greek translation that I find myself talking a lot about this season. When it was put together, someone decided to divide the single book of Samuel into two and the single book of Kings into two. I guess thematically, I'm not sure why they did it exactly the way that they did it, but they essentially cut them in half. But in Hebrew, Samuel is one book, Kings is one book. Some people will even make the argument that Samuel and Kings together were even one book. These books, according to the Jewish tradition, the book of Samuel is attributed to the judge whose name is Samuel, and the book of Kings is attributed to the prophet Jeremiah. I do not doubt that these men were involved in the creation of these books. But you'll see if you simply read it that Samuel died before a lot of the events of the books of Samuel. The Book of Kings is very obviously a compilation of a lot of different sources. Specifically, there are court records that are in there, and then there are other narrative books that are mentioned, actually even cited within the scripture. And then there are obviously oral traditions that are a part of it as well. And those oral traditions are probably really where Jeremiah would have had some involvement. But if you open up Kings, you'll often see this one phrase, especially as you get into the second half of First Kings, moving into Second Kings, and that is not the story of so-and-so king recorded in the book of the Chronicles of Judah's kings? You'll also see another one that's, is not this also recorded in the book of the Acts of Solomon? So within Kings, you have actual references to other books. And as a person who thinks of herself sort of as a historian and does a lot of nonfiction reading, that actually kind of tickles me because it's like, this is the first Chicago Manual of Style way of footnoting the places so that all these editors who put everything together in the end, they're telling us where to look and they're saying, hey, I'm citing my sources. So I love that that's been happening for thousands and thousands of years. These people were not wanting to plagiarize those who came before them. As a side note about the book of the Chronicles of Judah's Kings, I remember when I was young and we would come across this in Sunday school teachers telling us that what was being referenced was the book of Chronicles that is also in our Old Testaments. And like Samuel and Kings, the division between First and Second Chronicles came much later. That is not original to the text itself. But the main thing about the Book of Chronicles is that it was actually written after the exile. Tradition says that Ezra was the one who wrote the Book of Chronicles and put it together. The history and the composition of Chronicles is enough information for an entirely separate podcast, so we won't get in that today, but I just wanted to alert you to the fact that when you see that in your translation, it's actually a completely different book that is being cited, and that is a book that we don't have anymore. Hopefully it's out there. Hopefully one day we will find it and discover it. But that is just our version of Kings citing a resource that they were using in the compilation of what would become the official scriptural history of Israel. The scribes who created this final form, they were probably working just before the Babylonians invaded Judah. In fact, if you ask biblical linguists when they think that Samuel and Kings were finalized, that will be their answer, that it was before Nebuchadnezzar came in. It was before the exile. And a lot of that is because of the ways the stories are told, the vocabulary that is used in there, and even the style of the writing. Languages evolve, and if you want to think about it the way the English language has evolved over time, if you read Chaucer, or if you read Shakespeare, or if you read something I've written, it's all English, but our English language has evolved markedly between those different periods of writing. People who study this and people who are so much smarter than me, they look at it and they can recognize based on sentence structure and vocabulary and all of that when writings were created. They say, for a lot of reasons, that it was right at the end of the time of the nation of Judah. And the theory is, and it makes total sense, is that the last kings of Judah realized what was going on in the world. And we'll talk about what was going on in the world, actually more next week. But they realized what was going on in the world, and they wanted to have a resource. They wanted to have all of the history of Israel written down for future generations so that it wouldn't be lost in the event that Jerusalem was attacked and razed, as it would be in 586. You'll remember from episode 3 of this season that the word that gets translated as Egypt in our translations is Mitzrayim. Early in Genesis, it is used as the name of a person and also the name of a place. In those early uses, it tends to be transliterated as Mitzrayim, whereas later on, beginning in Genesis 12 and then all the way through the rest of our Bibles, it is always consistently translated as Egypt. So that translation to Egypt begins with Joseph. It continues through the Exodus, through the conquest of Canaan, and all the way into the monarchical period that we're going to be talking about today. So the history of the ancient state of Israel can really be divided into 2 phases. The United Kingdom, which was ruled by Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. And then the period of the divided kingdom, where you had the tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the south. The southern kingdom is often referred to as Judah. And then you also had all of the other 10 tribes up in the north. I call it the northern kingdom to keep it easy. The Bible sometimes refers to those 10 tribes as Israel, sometimes refers to them as Samaria. And this can get really confusing because the Bible also sometimes refers to United Israel as Israel. As we talk about this, what I try to do is talk about the United Kingdom, and that's Saul, David, Solomon. And then beyond that, when I am differentiating between the North and the South, I call them the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. As I said, there are lots of different names, and even the Bible refers to them in different ways. But this is how I try to keep it separate in my head. So that's what those words are going to mean today, and actually into next week as well. During the United Kingdom, which is probably my favorite bit of history, it's definitely my favorite bit of archaeology. The Bible describes this diplomatic relationship between Egypt and Israel. We don't get a lot of information about Egypt and Saul or Egypt and David interacting, but we do with Solomon. Because of the way the Bible frames the story of Solomon putting his country together after David's death, we see that Egypt is incredibly important to him. So right at the beginning of 1 Kings, David has died. Solomon is beginning to consolidate his power as this new king of Israel. And 1 Kings 3:1 tells us that he, quote, arranged a marriage alliance with Pharaoh. Solomon did this before he built the temple, before he built any of his palaces, before he did any of the fundamental things that kings usually start with. The first thing that he did was marry an Egyptian. It has this line here, and then right after that, it goes on to tell us some of the stories we're used to hearing about Solomon. We hear about him requesting wisdom and receiving it. Then you have the very detailed descriptions of him building cities, of him building the temple, the people that he worked with, all the materials that went in there. You also see him forming political alliances with other kingdoms. All of this happens, and then in 1 Kings 9, we finally get a few more details about this marriage. This just little blip in the 3rd chapter suddenly pops back up in chapter 9, and it says Pharaoh, Egypt's king, had captured Gezer, set it on fire, killed the Canaanites who were dwelling there, and then given the entire city as a dowry for his daughter who married Solomon. That's in 1 Kings 9:16. If you've forgotten that Solomon had already married this woman back in chapter 3, this may kind of seem like a throwaway sentence, but there is so much important stuff packed in here. Gezer will become an incredibly important city for Solomon. As he is building Israel, one important thing he does is raise 3 military outpost cities. If you go back further in my podcast, I think it's during season 1, I have an episode that is all about Solomon's gates, Gezer, Hatzor, and Megiddo. Archaeologists have gone to these tells, they have dug, and in all of those places, they have found massive structures, walls that have 6-chambered gates within them, lots of stables that would have housed hundreds of horses for cavalry, and palaces. The Bible and archaeology lets us know what Solomon did with Gezer and actually these other cities as well. But what the Bible doesn't tell us is who actually gave it to him. In the silence of the Bible, what do? Of course, but we turn to Egypt's historical record and see if we can find anything. Gezer does pop up in a few Egyptian records. None of the time is exactly right for Solomon, but it shows that there was a distinct connection between Egypt and what was a Canaanite city prior to Egypt conquering it and giving it to Solomon. First, there was a guy named Pharaoh Thutmose III. I don't think that I have mentioned him yet in the podcast because he hasn't really overlapped with the Bible, but he is regarded as Egypt's greatest leader. In his release at the temple at Karnak, he claims to have destroyed Gezer in 1496 BCE, almost 500 years earlier than the time that we're talking about. Also, if you remember the episode about Akhenaten, his father was Amenhotep III. And at Gezer in excavations, they have found seal impressions that have Amenhotep III's name, which indicates that there was a strong trading relationship in between what was then the Canaanite city and Egypt. And that would have been about 100 years after Thutmose. Then, about 100 years after that, is when our old friend, Pharaoh Merneptah, claims to have captured Gezer. So on that same stela that mentions the people of Israel, that stela was made about 1205 BCE. Merneptah claims that Gezer was one of the cities that he went in and destroyed. What is great is that Gezer has these large destruction layers at the right time during Iron Age 1, which is 1200 to 1000 BCE. There's really no doubt that these pharaohs did come through. They did conquer the area. After one particularly thick destruction layer, we do see that Solomon's city was planted on top of that. We can't be sure who created that destruction layer. Maybe as archaeology continues, there will be some clue found there, and we'll be able to answer this in the future. But for now, we don't know. Merneptah and his destruction would have been way too early for him to have been the pharaoh that gave his daughter to Solomon. The next pharaoh who came and destroyed Gezer was a man named Shoshank I. We'll talk about him in a minute. But he would have been much too late. And so the likely answer is that the unnamed pharaoh who gave his daughter to Solomon is probably one of these weaker rulers who would have ruled during this third intermediate period that we're talking about today. So while Solomon was around and Israel was one united kingdom, we can see that Egypt was a partner. It was important to whoever was ruling Egypt that they had a peaceful relationship with Israel. And so he gave his daughter. It was important to Solomon that they had a peaceful relationship with Egypt, because as you go through the time of Solomon's reign, it talks about Solomon getting horses from the nation of Egypt. And it's obvious that there is a strong trading relationship between them. However, Solomon dies. And after Solomon dies, the United Kingdom splits. There was a man named Jeroboam who was kind of like a project manager for Solomon. He was running teams of men who were out building Solomon's cities in Jerusalem and elsewhere. Well, one day when Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem to go somewhere, I'm going to guess maybe going to one of these other build sites, a prophet told him that God was going to take 10 of the tribes of Israel and make Jeroboam the king over them. As you can imagine, Solomon, when he heard this, was not really thrilled at the idea. And so the Bible says that he set out to kill Jeroboam. And so Jeroboam fled. And interestingly enough, he fled to Egypt, where he stayed with a pharaoh that the Bible names Shishak. Shishak was Shoshank I within the Egyptian history. Solomon eventually died. The Bible doesn't tell us how long that took, how long Jeroboam was down in Egypt. It could have been a few days, it could have been a few years. But when Solomon died, a civil war broke out, and indeed the kingdom of Israel was split. Jeroboam went north, took the 10 tribes of the north, and another man named Rehoboam, who actually was Solomon's son, he took over and he ruled Judah and Benjamin in the south. From here, the Book of Kings gets even harder to follow. And this is why I started off by talking about how the Book of Kings is a compilation of several different sources. The perspective of the book tends to change back and forth from Judah being the focus to Israel being the focus, meaning from the southern kingdom being the focus to the northern kingdom being a focus. The names that are used there are not common to us today. And sometimes kings have same names. Sometimes kings of different nations have same names. And it can be really difficult to follow. Sometimes you don't know if either it's the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom fighting against each other, or if they're fighting against Aram or Egypt, or even some of the old Canaanite tribes that are still floating around, like the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Edomites. Sometimes they're even just fighting amongst themselves. And so in the Book of Kings, you can't just go in there and pick out a few verses or a paragraph. It's really important to pay attention to the entire passage's context. That's always important when we're talking about the Bible, but it's especially important here because Kings is just all of the greatest hits in history for both of these nations thrown at you at the same time. And so you really have to pay attention to remember where you are in history. So once Israel is divided between the north and the south, Egypt goes from being the ally that they had been to Solomon and supposedly the ally that they had been to Jeroboam when he was staying down there to being an aggressor. 5 years after Jeroboam went back to Israel and founded that northern kingdom, Shishak attacked Jerusalem and plundered the temple. You can read about this in 1 Kings 14, 25 to 26. The Bible doesn't mention Shishak going up into the northern kingdom. And so we want to take a look at the Egyptian records to see what may or may not be there. Shishak, who is Shoshank I, he inscribed something called the Bubastite Gate that is part of the temple at Karnak. The reliefs on the gate are up there in honor of Shoshank's god, and it shows him pulling a rope that has 120 slaves attached to it, and then each slave is named with the town that person represents, a town that Shoshank claimed to have conquered in 925 BCE. Jerusalem is not mentioned. Samaria, which would have been the capital, it is not mentioned. Gezer isn't mentioned either, but there's 120 areas that are mentioned. A lot of the words Egyptologists don't know what they mean, but what we do have is this testimony in the Bible that Jerusalem was taken by Shishak. Then we have Shoshank's relief saying that in 925 BCE, I conquered all of these cities. And then there are destruction layers all over Israel and all of the cities that are mentioned by Shoshank and many others besides that were destroyed and have been linked to an Egyptian campaign that was in the area. Destruction layers are obviously terrible because they indicated that there was destruction, but they're also really great for archaeologists, as sad as that is to say, because they leave an indelible mark in the ground. They are often dark and ashy. And if it was a big destruction, like when the Babylonians came in and razed Jerusalem, you will have very thick layers of black. And those lines will just mark out. And it's like, okay, here's an event that happened. Oftentimes within those destruction layers, pieces of clay will have survived so that we can then identify based on writings exactly when that destruction happened. So they're great markers and they're really helpful to the archaeological record. And they're something that we can really rely on when we're trying to date civilizations and figure out when things happened and how the world as a whole fit together back then. We're going to pause here for today. We are basically at the end of our book of 1 Kings. And at the end of 1 Kings, Egypt is an outside foe against the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel. And the northern and southern kingdoms are busy fighting with each other. But all of that changes as we get deeper into 2 Kings and as we get farther down into history, because we're going to start seeing the entrance of much bigger and badder empires. Next week, Egypt's power is really going to be reducing because foreign empires, not just nations, but empires, are going to start coming after Egypt. And at times they're going to succeed. The Red-Haired Archaeologist podcast is researched, hosted, and recorded by me, Amanda Hote-Haley. It is sound edited by Nicholas Allaire. New episodes are released each Thursday. To interact with me and other listeners, make sure you click the follow button on the Red-Haired Archaeologist pages on Facebook and Instagram. Then check out my website at redhairedarchaeologist.com, where you can subscribe to my monthly email and book me to come speak in your town.